Have you found your dream job as a developer? Or are you stuck in an unfulfilling job? On WeAreDevelopers.com, you find over 1,000 jobs in Europe that fit the tech stack that you want to work with, and salaries go up to $130K. All you have to do is create a free profile, and you automatically get matched with jobs that fit your requirements. So what are you waiting for? Create your free profile and let companies apply to you now.
Zeiss? I think you should go to Zeiss.
Zeiss Digital Partners.
The amaze of knowledge.
Hello everyone,
industry.
come sit down. We're about to start. There are still some seats here at the front. There's some over there as well. Come in, welcome. There's some more seats over here I can see. Well, I'm very happy you're all here. Now, if I was to ask you to predict the future, what would you do to do that? I'm kind of curious. I'm pretty sure if we would ask a historian, they would dive into history and then try and look at the past and kind of like extrapolate from that. If we would ask a data analyst, then they would probably jump into the data and try to figure out how to predict the future from that. And that's kind of what we're going to do with this next talk. We are going to dive into what the state is of web development right now. We're going to look at a bunch of studies, and we're going to predict the future thanks to that. Now, our next speaker grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and they are a data evangelist for Netlify. Please give it up for the fabulous Laurie Voss.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. There are an awful lot of you. I don't know if you can tell when you're in the crowd how terrifying it is to see you all. So it's very important that my first order of business is I conquer my nerves by taking an audience selfie. Everyone pretend you've just seen the best talk of your entire life. Wow, the best talk of your life sucked, apparently. I'm having a great time at this conference. It's awesome. It's very well organized. Kudos to the organizers. Also, it's Pride Month. At least it is in the US. I hear Berlin's is in July. But either way, happy Pride Month to everyone who celebrates. There's one queer in the audience. That's it, really? Really? Happy Pride Month, everyone. Thank you. So, with those two things out of the way, I should give a little bit of an introduction about myself. I have been a web developer for 26 years now. For a while there, I was the co-founder of NPM Inc., which you may have heard of, and a bunch of other companies that I promise that you haven't. But I've always been a keen observer of the web development industry. And for the last 12 years, my job has involved analyzing data about what web developers are doing and how web development is changing. Using data in the last 5 years from tens of thousands of surveys. My talk today is about a model of how web development technology changes over time. I'm going to use some examples from history to show how the model works, and then I'm going to take a leap and try and predict where web development is going to go in the next 5 years. As a spoiler, you are going to hate the prediction. I hate the prediction, and it's my prediction, so you're definitely going to hate the prediction. I'm not here to make you angry, but I might anyway, so I apologize in advance. People tend not to believe things that they hate, so I'm going to be very careful about building the case for this prediction that you're going to hate. So let's start with the model. There's not a lot to it. The beginning of the cycle is that people have some kind of problem, and they try all sorts of things to solve that problem, and they get paid a lot of money for solving the problem. And there's a period of wild experimentation where people just do random stuff, seeing what works. Once somebody hits upon a solution that works, everybody's like, cool, I want that solution. And you find yourself in the web development industry building the same thing over and over and over because everybody needs the same solution and nobody has it. You begin to form best practices. Eventually, those best practices solidify. People figure out the good way to do it, and then some clever person writes it down. They make it a blog post, or they make it a conference talk, or they make it a book. And then developers get bored because the problem is solved. We're done. We don't want to do this anymore. You've got design patterns locked in. Then one of those bored developers realizes that they can build a general solution to the problem to prevent them having to build it over and over and over. This is more interesting to the developer because it's a more complicated problem, and it means that they never have to build that solution again, or at least that is the idea behind a framework. Never really works out that way. Turning it into a product or a service like this is commoditization. The process of commoditization is not clean or simple. It's not one person gets the idea and then builds the whole thing. Dozens of people get the same idea to build the same framework at the same time, and they all do it simultaneously. And then there's people form religious attachments. There are flame wars. People go up on conferences and accuse of other people of doing it wrong, and it can be brutal. But eventually, you see a consolidation to one winner or maybe a small handful of winners. And the reason that happens is economics. It is simpler to have one way to do things. Even if all of the ways are pretty good, if there's only one way to do things, then you only need one set of documentation. You need to only write one integration. And you can hire for people who already know how to solve it that way, which is an important part of solving the problem. You need to be able to hire people who already know how to do it. So economics favors consolidation. The process of consolidation is not fun for almost anyone involved. The process generates a lot of complaints. The complaints partially come from the people who used to make a lot of money solving the problem over and over and over, because solving the same problem over and over is actually pretty easy, and you can make a lot of money doing it. So why are you spoiling my fun by turning it into a product, and now I have to find something else to do? They can also argue, and they often do, that building a completely customized solution to your application is going to be better than using this framework. And they are correct about that. Writing a completely custom solution is going to be better, but it's not going to be so much better that it's worth spending all of the extra money to have a completely bespoke solution when you could just use the framework. The framework will be a lot cheaper, and it will be ready faster. So economics, again, is what's driving this. A quick note on vocabulary here. I'm going to say framework over and over. It can be a framework, it can be a product, it can be a service. Just assume I mean all three of those words every single time. All of this leads to stage 7, which is whining about the fundamentals. Thank you. It is apparently impossible to skip this step of people whining about the fundamentals. People who used to build the thing from scratch will complain about the framework. They will say that people who are using the framework are forgetting the fundamentals. And apparently, forgetting the fundamentals is the worst thing that you can do, and people who don't know the fundamentals are going to build terrible software, and they're just bad people. While those people are still whining, everybody else is at stage 8. Which is the mass adoption of the new way of doing things. The people who show up in stage 8, they don't know the fundamentals. They learn only the framework. They don't care about the fundamentals, and somehow they still get stuff done. So maybe the fundamentals aren't quite as fundamental as the other people seem to think. It's important to keep in mind that every stage of this cycle involves more people, a lot more people, twice as many people. The number of people involved who are building, know the best practices is twice as many as did the experiments. The people who commoditize the product, there's twice as many of them as were using the design systems, and the people whining them about the fundamentals are vastly outnumbered by the people who are just getting on with it. The last stage of the process is migration. This is where the people who were involved right at the beginning have to decide what they're going to do. They have two options. They can become the people who build the framework. That is always going to be an option available to you. The framework doesn't stop evolving. People need to maintain it and expand it and adapt to it. So there's always going to be work for people who are working on the original thing. But there's a lot more jobs building the new thing, using the new thing, way more jobs. And so most people end up migrating to the new thing and becoming people who build it the new way. The people who are specialized, the people who dig down into the original way of doing things, they get so good at doing it that it becomes impossible for anyone to compete with them. They're so good at building this framework that there's no point trying to build a new framework because it's got years and years and years of advance on everybody else. So that is the full cycle. You get wild experimentation, then you get best practices, then you get design patterns, then you get commoditization, then you get intense competition, then you get consolidation, then you get whining about the fundamentals. I cannot stress enough that it is impossible to skip that step. Then you get mass adoption, and then you get migration. In reality, the cycle is not so clean. These stages overlap, and there's usually several of these cycles going on at the same time in different parts of the stack. The result is that technology in web development is a layer cake of the things that developers used to have to care about and no longer do, or fewer people do. We call this layer cake the stack, and new layers in the stack show up occasionally as technology advances, and the old ones get abstracted away. So the funny thing about the stack is that nobody really agrees what's in it. Few people agree, like, where's the front end, where's the back end, what is the middle of the stack? Is there such a thing as a full stack developer? I do not think there could possibly be, because the stack is so huge. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it should be that there is no such thing as the fundamentals. We can't possibly agree what would be fundamental to web development, and I'm going to demonstrate that over and over. But more importantly, if you can get your job done without knowing about stuff lower in the stack, then it doesn't matter that you don't know that stuff. It is gatekeeping nonsense to say that people need to learn stuff that you know just to get the job done if they don't really need to know it. When I started doing web development, HTML was an application of SGML. And people said, oh, to understand HTML, you need to know SGML. It's fundamental. How many people in this room have even heard of SGML, far less know what to do with it? And HTML isn't an application of SGML anymore. So to prove to you how this works, I'm going to do a very quick history of the web. Because it's important that you believe me when I say that this pattern is real and that this pattern is unbreakable. Because, like I said, I'm going to use this pattern to make a prediction, and you're going to hate the prediction. You will want to whine about the fundamentals. And what I'm hoping that you will do is instead embrace the change that's coming. The web was born in 1998, and the way that you built a website in 1989 was you manually wrote some HTML, you saved it to your hard drive, and then you started a piece of software that ran on your computer under your desk, and that was it. That was the state of the art. There was a period of intense competition about how to make a web server, in which there were hundreds of HTTP servers. But they soon began to consolidate. One very popular option was Apache, and soon everybody was either using Apache or something that looked a lot like Apache. And very soon, very few people were bothering to write their own HTTP server. Not nobody, because Apache would be replaced by Nginx 10 years later. Stuff lower in the stack does sometimes see competition. It's just much less intense. By 1994, the major innovation was the Common Gateway Interface, or CGI. CGI let your application respond to post queries from browsers, and suddenly websites weren't just static files, websites could be dynamic. That had to start sometime, right? So now you could write a piece of software that could parse HTTP requests and respond dynamically with content, and run that on your computer under your desk. And this started a period of wild experimentation in servers. First, you installed Apache, and then you got really started. You started parsing HTTP headers. Eventually, somebody was like, this is a pain in the ass. Let me do it in Perl. Then somebody was like, I've got a better idea. How about I let you build your personal homepage by wrapping some libraries in C? Thus was born PHP in 1995. PHP parsed the HTTP headers for you so you didn't have to do that, and it took care of sending the HTML back to the browser for you. You still had to write everything in between those two steps, but believe it or not, people complained that PHP was forgetting the fundamentals of web development. People told me that directly to my face. They were like, unless you are parsing HTTP headers yourself, you don't know what the hell you're doing as a web developer. Meanwhile, over in hardware, sticking a computer under your desk was getting really boring. People kept tripping over the power cord, so people decided to make whole custom-built buildings full of networking and power, and racks, and you could co-locate your servers there. Pretty soon, people got tired of driving back and forth to the co-located server, and somebody was like, hey, what if I just hire some people, and they sort of live at the building, and you just pay with a credit card, and we rack the servers for you, and we take care of the power, and we take care of the networking. And people were like, that's great, because the co-located server is far away, and I hate driving. So there followed a period of intense competition. I could not find any of the original hosting logos, by the way. Those companies are gone. Suddenly, there were hundreds and thousands of competing services, competing companies doing almost the same thing, racking up servers for you and then renting them out. They had different options. They did things slightly differently. They priced things slightly differently. But there was a gigantic competitive fight that drove prices down enormously and made web development much, much cheaper. That is the core of commoditization. Everybody wanted a server. Everybody wanted Apache on that server. Most people were OK with that server being Linux. They needed a database. MySQL was there. And that was the birth of the LAMP stack. Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP was the way that you did web development for a solid decade there. It was just bedrock to how we did things. And that was true even though none of those companies had anything to do with each other. And in fact, Linux didn't even have a company at the time. Economics is often the driver of this cycle. The thing that wins the cycle is often the cheapest thing. The LAMP stack became popular because it was cheap. The operating system was free, PHP and MySQL were free. But LAMP became even cheaper because once everybody knew it, that drove a reinforcing cycle where new projects got started in LAMP and new people learned LAMP, and therefore there were more people who already knew it, and therefore it was cheaper to hire them, and therefore you started more projects and so on. So what were people building on the LAMP stack? Well, it turns out they were mostly building blogs. In fact, somebody realized that nearly every website in the world can be generalized to, well, it's kind of like a blog. In 1999, there were 23 blogs online, and in 2006, there were 50 million. This led to, you'll never guess, a period of intense competition. Suddenly, there were thousands upon thousands of competing pieces of blog software, and they were all basically the same. There's not a lot of difference in what a blog looks like from one piece of software to the other. But when I tell you there were thousands of pieces of software doing this, and the result was that WordPress basically won the war. It became a framework. WordPress became the way that you build a website in general. It was so popular that 43% of websites on the internet today are powered by WordPress. And that's true even though WordPress these days is not always used as the thing that serves the HTML. It's often used as an API to a backend. So now you're beginning to get the idea. There's a period of intense competition. We have a problem. We solve the problem. There's a big wall of logos of companies that you don't remember, and then 3 logos that you recognize because they won. And this keeps getting faster and happening over and over. So let's go faster. Introduced in 2004 and peaking in 2006, Rails changed the game for building web applications. Every framework since Rails owes a debt to it for concepts that it popularized. And people who were building in Rails were routinely accused of forgetting the web development fundamentals, whatever they happened to be. And the people who accused them of that were still wrong. In 2006, jQuery was introduced and smoothed over the Web API, and it was enormously popular. It was so popular that even though jQuery peaked in 10 years ago, 50% of web developers in 2021 say that they are still using jQuery. Lots of people said that learning jQuery was ignoring the fundamentals of web development, which is funny because jQuery got so popular that the browser manufacturers built jQuery into the web browser. Every time you use Query Selector All, you're using jQuery. You just don't have to install jQuery to do that anymore. jQuery became the fundamentals. So what even does that mean for the fundamentals? Which brings us to a subtlety in the model, which is that the thing that invents the idea and the framework or product that wins the space are not necessarily the same thing. For instance, WordPress has 43% share of all websites, but WordPress.com is not the winner in the space. WPEngine.com has 63% of the WordPress market, even though it is not WordPress. Speaking of the people who made the thing and the people who made all the money being different, there's GitHub. Launched in 2008, exploded in popularity. Source control had been a thing forever, but GitHub made it really easy. Until then, open source software was distributed on SourceForge. Do you remember SourceForge? But the people who made Git and the people who made GitHub are very much not the same folks. Over in the land of co-location and hardware, it was finally time to make a change. In 2006, AWS introduced EC2, which abstracted away the hardware. So now instead of renting a specific computer in a specific building, you were just renting the idea of a computer. That virtual computer had memory and a hard drive, but you didn't know what kind. And in fact, it was actually just a fraction of a much bigger computer. And you probably didn't know where it was, except that it was probably in Virginia somewhere. And suddenly your hardware-level concerns as a web developer were gone. Up until then, it had seemed like knowing how the hardware worked was fundamental to web development, and suddenly it wasn't. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people who know about hardware. There's still thousands of people who make their living racking up servers and running networking and making sure the power works. Like, there's more of them than ever, and there are huge companies that make enormous amounts of money doing that stuff. But as a web developer, you don't need to care anymore. And of course, in cloud computing, there wasn't one winner. In addition to AWS, there's Azure and Google Cloud and Alibaba and a solid dozen other companies in the space. There's lots of competition in cloud hosting, but you don't need to care because AWS has 33% market share, which means that everybody else works suspiciously like AWS, and everybody else has services that are suspiciously similarly named to whatever the AWS version of that software is. The concept of cloud hosting has won the space to a degree that you probably don't even think about it as a choice you're making anymore. In the same way that in 2005, you spun up a LAMP server without thinking about it. It was just how you did that thing. Back in the land of software, Node.js was introduced in 2009, and NPM was invented shortly after that. Initially, NPM was all about Node, but by 2014, it had become about JavaScript in general. And that's when it really took off. NPM is a really great example of the difference in scale between these stages of the cycle. NPM is a distribution channel for open source, like SourceForge before it. SourceForge today gets 15 million downloads per week, and in the last 7 days, NPM served 40 billion downloads. In a week, React gets more downloads than every piece of software on SourceForge combined. And I'm going to be talking about React in a bit. But this is not me making fun of SourceForge. This is me talking about how the scale, the jump in scale between these sections of the cycle is important. WordPress is not twice as popular as the second leading piece of blog software. It is hundreds of thousands of times more popular. It's just in a completely different game. So let's skip ahead to the present. Let's take for granted that Docker is a framework, Kubernetes is a framework on top of that, TypeScript is a framework on top of that. You can blame the company for the security policy that makes this keep happening. Because if there's one thing you should know by now, it's that web developers are getting bored easily, so I'm going to skip to the present. We've toured all of the past cycles. What is in the middle of the cycle right now? What's at stage 5? The first is serverless. We've been abstracting away hardware, so why not go even further? AWS released Lambda in 2014. Forget hardware, forget virtual servers, forget an operating system, forget server software. What if you just wrote a function and deployed that? And AWS takes care of making sure the input gets to your function and the output of your function goes back to the browser at essentially arbitrary scale. We call this phase serverless, and I'm still kind of mad about that because there's so many more servers. There's more servers than there ever were. But whatever, that's what we called it. And the serverless revolution is far from done. We're definitely at stage 5. There's still lots of people deploying without using serverless, and there are still tons of people competing to be the way that you do serverless deploys. It hasn't standardized yet. But in our survey data, In 2021, 46% of people said that they were already using serverless, and in 2022, we expect that number to be well over 50%. It's becoming the norm. There's going to be consolidation. And if you thought me talking about NPM a little while ago was a self-serving reference, you're going to love this bit where I talk about Netlify. Because the other technology that I see in stage 5 right now is the one represented by services like Netlify. We can loosely refer to them as the Jamstack without rabbit-holing on the definition. Assume you're using source control. Assume you want a CDN. Assume you are doing CI. And assume that you want serverless functions. And definitely assume that you don't want to have to set up all of that stuff yourself. That's Netlify. It's a framework for doing all of those things at the same time, because those problems got boring for us. Netlify is currently in the intense competition phase. AWS has Amplify. How on earth did they come up with that name? And then there's Vercel. Azure probably has something. I forget what it's called. All of them are doing roughly the same thing. They're taking a thing that used to be your concern, how to run tests, how to deploy, how to preview changes before you send them to production, and they're turning that into one thing that you don't have to think about anymore. And it's great. We love it. Who's going to win the space? Obviously, I've made my bet by going to work for Netlify. But to some extent, it doesn't matter because the space has been won. Jamstack is already on its way to winning the market. So now let's talk about React. Introduced in 2013, React is enormous. React's model for encapsulated components solved a huge pain point in web development. It also went massively against received wisdom about how to put websites together. It threw HTML and JavaScript together, and sometimes even the CSS, and the CSS was written in JavaScript, and people hated that. But React demonstrated that web development best practices had got stuck in a rut, and you could do things differently, and the result was that it was enormously popular. These days, 68% of web developers in our survey say that they are using React to build websites. And there are definitely tons of people whining about the fundamentals. There are lots of people saying that if you only know React, you're not a real web developer because you don't know the fundamentals, and that's just as not true as it was all of the other times. I've only seen one front-end framework that in my entire life that was as big as React is now, and that was jQuery, which asks the question, is the same thing that happened to jQuery going to happen to React? Are the browser manufacturers going to build React into the browser somehow? Maybe. It would certainly make our websites a lot lighter and a lot faster. Jeremy Keith yesterday talked about how we send way too much JavaScript to the client, and I agree. And one of the ways to reduce that is to build it into the browser so we don't have to send JavaScript to the client. What we already have is web components, highly performant and built into browsers. They encapsulate code, behavior, and style. They seem a lot like React components, but the syntax is really annoying. So I really hope that somebody finds a way to combine the syntax of React that developers obviously love with the performance of web components, and then we can all be happy. One way that you can tell that a solution is about to win is that some people decide that that solution has already won and start building new solutions based on that. There are a bunch of new frameworks now like Astro and Remix and SolidJS and Vite, which assume that you're already using React. They assume you like React. They assume you know how it works, and that they focus on solving other problems. So what happens if we do the same thing? What happens if we assume that React is going to win? Maybe it'll get absorbed into the web, maybe it won't. Assume it hits like 80%, 90% share of the market. Can we predict the next turn in the cycle? Could it be the metaverse? No. They haven't even figured out how to draw feet. That stuff is clearly not ready. What about Web 3? Hell no. I could do a whole talk about how building your entire web infrastructure by modeling it as a series of financial transactions is a terrible idea, and if you want me to do that, invite me to your conference. But we don't need to talk about the pros and cons of crypto. We just need to look at the number of people in this space. It's still at the wild experimentation phase. And then there's Web 5, and I really wish I was joking about Web 5, but Jack Dorsey announced Web 5 last week. I don't know why there isn't a Web 4. Web 5 is definitely not Web 5. Whatever Jack Dorsey got high and imagined last week is not going to be the future. The way to figure out what's next is to look at the history and especially to look at what is the thing that we are bored of doing now, because boredom is what is driving this cycle. We abstracted away the hardware, we abstracted away the operating system and the server, and there's intense competition between frameworks. And we think we might see a winner, so what happens if it's React? What happens if you're bored of doing React and you abstract React away? I'm going to show you a product called Databricks. As a disclosure, I have nothing to do with Databricks as a company. I just predicted 3 years ago that somebody would build a product like this, and they DM'd me on Twitter last week to say, hey, we built that product you predicted. And I was like, great, I'll give you a demo. You run npx create ReactBricks app, and it creates a development environment for you that runs on your local machine. This is what it looks like. It is a rich editor for a web app, and it's running on your laptop. ReactBricks allows you to build a multi-page web app by dragging and dropping React components that somebody else built for you. And you can use the sidebar to customize their properties and behavior. But you don't have to know how to code to use ReactBricks. And if you do, you can also create your own reusable components. The components are React with some custom elements that allow you to tell the editor where the text should go and stuff like that. Imagine a world where ReactBricks gets really, really popular. There would be enough existing components that you could build a whole website without ever having to drop down into the code. You could do one drag and drop to get a blog. You could do one drag and drop to get images, one drag and drop to get your Stripe integration, and 3 drags and drops later, you have an e-commerce website. You could build a whole website without knowing any React. In fact, you could build a whole website without knowing any HTML. And I don't know about you, but that idea kind of freaks me out. A web developer who doesn't know HTML, that web developer is ignoring the fundamentals. I love HTML, and I hate this prediction, even though it's my prediction. But that's what makes me believe that this is a persuasive vision of the future, because I hate this. And the things that we hate tend to be the things that win this cycle. That's the thing that we see over and over. And also, if you think about it, this is how web development was always supposed to work. The very first web browser, World Wide Web, built by Tim Berners-Lee, it was a WYSIWYG editor. It expected you to be dragging and dropping and typing stuff in directly. What could be more fundamental than fulfilling the original vision of the web as a thing where you didn't need to know any code to write it? And once again, the economics are pointing the way. Web developers have never been in so much demand. We make so much money, and we are effectively building the same thing over and over. A login system, a list display, a search box, an address form. People have got very excited about design systems, and they're right to, but design systems are just the start. You have to automate it. Because of the fact of the matter is, the world needs far more websites than we've got right now. Our websites suck. And the reason that our websites suck is because we don't have time to build them well. And the reason we don't have time to build them well is because there's not enough of us. We need 10 times as many web developers as we have so that the world can have the websites that it deserves. Yesterday, we saw a demonstration of GitHub Copilot, which is ML, not AI, that predicts your code. Because so many people have written the same code, the ML can predict what you're going to write next. GitHub's position is that Copilot will write that code for you, and my position is that if the ML can figure out what you're supposed to write, you shouldn't have to write it at all. You shouldn't have to write any of that code. It should be a component that you dropped in already. And you may be thinking that this is scary, and I agree that it is scary. As a person who loves HTML and a web developer for my whole life, the idea that people could do my job without knowing the thing that is central to my core, it's terrifying. But if the future happens this way, you're going to find yourself with 2 options. You can specialize down, like I said. You can become one of the people who builds the components, and you can get really, really good at it. Or you can become one of the people who adapts to the new way and starts building these websites that way. Or, as a special bonus 3rd option, because you're here, you can become the person who builds that framework. Because, I'll be honest, the chances of ReactBricks being the winner of this space are basically 0 at this point. It is the very first iteration of the cycle, and there are dozens of companies taking a swing at building websites this way right now. This is the period of wild experimentation for this software. But I'm taking 26 years of experience and 10 years of data analysis, and I'm sticking a stake in the ground that says the future is this way. And if you look at the React component future and you're like, nah, that's not a big enough change, let's do something even more terrifying, then Joel Spolsky's talk is next. And he's talking about the block protocol, which is like this idea, but even bigger. And I recommend that you check it out. And of course, I could be wrong. I've been wrong about lots of things throughout my career. If I'm wrong, then we can all come back in 5 years and you can point and laugh. But if I'm right, we'll all be at BricsConf, and you can say that you heard it here first. Either way, I hope I've given you something to think about your career and your industry and what the future could hold, and I thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The one and only Laurie Voss, everyone. That was absolutely great. I feel like when somebody shows you the matrix, you see it absolutely everywhere. I was using Framer the other day, which is a tool that does exactly what Laurie just mentioned. React is everywhere. Ooh, it's terrifying. Okay, so up next, as Laurie said, we're going to be digging a little bit more into the future with Joel Spolsky. We'll be back in a little bit less than 5 minutes, so please come and sit down, or if you're heading over somewhere else, please make some space for somebody else to come and sit down. For those of you that are queuing at the back, there's quite a lot of space over here at the moment. And there's some space at the front. And of course, there's always standing space if we absolutely run out. Oh, by the way, if there's an empty seat next to you, maybe scoot in, and then that way we'll have a little bit more space for people. Be easier for them to come onto the edges. Okay, see you in a couple minutes. Bye bye.